All right. So, federalism in the Constitution. And federalism is something that has a tendency to come up on the AP test. It's pretty, I'm not going to say it's not unique to America by any means, but we are definitely one of the pioneers, at least with modern day federalism. And it's it's a little bit complex because it's that great balancing act between state governments and federal governments. So we're going to kind of look at it with regards to the Constitution. All right. So the Constitution addressing federalism. There's kind of three different categories that get addressed in the Constitution. You've got express powers, implied powers, and inherent powers, and we're going to go into those in a good bit more detail here in the next several slides. So, as far as the Constitution is concerned, you've got Articles 1 and 4. Article 1 is where the federal government is given a lot of its power in Article 1. Article 1, Section 8 gives powers, grants powers to the federal government. 9 denies powers, and 10 talks about the states a little bit. And then Article 4, Section 2 goes into more detail about the states. 10th Amendment gives states quite a bit of power. I mean, any powers not given to the federal government are reserved for states is more or less what it says. And then the 14th Amendment was very, very, very significant in a shift from very, very state-centered, or from at least a much more state-centered government to a more to stronger, a more nationalist government, if you will, or giving the federal government a lot more power. So first up, our expressed powers. Expressed, enumerated, delegated. They're all synonyms. If you see any one of those, you should know that these are powers that are stated specifically in the Constitution. And if we want to be specific, we're going to look at Article 1, Section 8. Hopefully that was something you noticed when you were working through your Constitution packets. And basically, we get 27 powers outlined in this bit. Things like being able to tax money, being able to tax the people, being able to print money, regulating trade between states, declaring war, raising and controlling armed forces. A lot of the problems that we had in the Articles of Confederation get addressed right here. And so the enumerated powers are powers that are given to the federal government. Next, we have the implied powers. These are things that are not specifically stated in the Constitution, but can be reasonably suggested by the expressed powers. And we're going to look at a couple of examples of that. So one of them is McCulloch, Maryland, and this is an important one to know. It doesn't hurt to do a little extra research here. I'm going to give you the gist of it, but this is a case that has a tendency to come up on the AP test, so be familiar with it. And the questions, there's two questions at hand in McCulloch versus Maryland. The main first, does Congress have the authority to make a federal bank? And then, can states tax a federal bank if Congress in fact has that authority? And the court decides that yes, the federal government can establish a bank. It is necessary and proper for things like taxation, as well as regulating money. And so because the federal government has the power to do those things, then it would need a bank. It is implied that it would have the ability to make a bank. And then it also goes on to determine that no, states cannot tax the federal bank. That violates the supremacy clause of the Constitution. And so Article 1, Section 8 addresses the necessary and proper clause. Article 6 addresses the supremacy clause. I don't remember the exact verbiage, but it's something along the lines of federal laws shall reign supreme, or something like that. And so the big thing that gets established here are these implied powers of the Constitution. So where do these implied powers come from? Well, they come from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 of the Constitution. Congress has power to make laws that shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution. take a second to look at that, read it. It may seem vague and broad to you, and it is, and you may disagree, or you may agree. I would say it tends to be a good thing if they try to specify every single thing that Congress has the ability to do. Then there's no way they could have thought of everything, and so that elastic clause, that elasticity that this provides them is important, and I kind of answered that second part there. Then we have the supremacy clause, which also gets addressed because Maryland cannot tax the federal banks. The supremacy clause comes from Article 6, Clause 2. Basically, the point was to address issues between the federal government and states, or between two states, or between a person and a state. The supremacy clause makes it so that when governments are in question, or our defendants have a stake, I think would probably be the way to put it, have a stake in the case, then the federal government will oversee that case, and that's why the federal laws reign supreme. So those are two big implied powers that come from the Constitution. Furthermore, we have Gibbons versus Ogden, and this is another one that has a tendency to show up on the AP test, so make sure that you're aware of it. I'm going to give you a little bit more background information here. Ogden has permission to sail a steamship. His permission came from the state of New York. Gibbons also has permission to sail a steamship, and his permission comes from the federal government. And the controversy is basically who is allowed to sail their steamship. They're kind of competing for business I think it's between New York and New Jersey, but you may want to look that up. They're competing for business, and Ogden is saying that Gibbons can't do it. So Gibbons, you notice his name comes first, he's the plaintiff, is suing Ogden, saying that his permit is valid. And this is a common issue between states. Is you've got a lot of trade between states, and remember one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation was the tariffs that were being placed on interstate commerce, and so this is an opportunity for the federal government to sort of establish itself, and so he disagrees with Ogden's monopoly. And so the question that comes into play is who has the right to regulate interstate commerce? And the Supreme Court agrees with Gibbons. They say that the federal permit is going to trump the New York permit. New York can't grant a monopoly to Ogden, and so this establishes the right of the federal government to regulate interstate commerce, because they're saying, no, New York, you can't monopolize these waters. Our permits are supreme, and so Gibbons also has the right to be in these waters. They're not granting a monopoly to Gibbons. They're just saying that both people can operate there. And if you disagree, go ahead and look at the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 addresses the ability to regulate interstate commerce. And then again, because federal laws are supreme, Article 6, Clause 2 justifies the government's ability to do that. And so what gets set up here is basically anything that can be regulated by interstate trade is regulated by the federal government. And so this is another example of implied powers, the implied powers that accompany regulating interstate commerce. Third and last, but certainly not least, we have the inherent powers. And these are things that simply exist because we are a nation. Things like regulating immigration, and if that means deportation, then that's something that comes with being a nation. Acquiring new territories, we haven't done that in some time, but think of the Louisiana Purchase and dealing with territories west of the Mississippi. Granting diplomatic recognition. I don't recall I think in an earlier video we talked about whether or not ISIS was legit, and And if we don't grant them diplomatic recognition, or if nations in general don't grant them diplomatic recognition, then part of it is being recognized by other states. So no, they would not be legitimate. So having the authority to recognize governments, and then again protecting our country from rebelling, being able to have an army that protects us as well. So those are the inherent powers. So keep note of those. Those are important terms to understand, because those are definitely the kinds of things that'll get asked in more detail on the AP test.